coexisting with the wildlife is a necessary reality out here. When I first moved to my property off-grid, actually the first day I drove out here and saw it, I went up the road a few miles into the national forest, and I didn't see any people, but I saw a cinnamon black bear. Which, if you've seen a cinnamon black bear before, the fur on it almost resembles that of a brown bear, but it's not a brown bear. It's a black bear with lighter fur. It happens seasonally. This one didn't have a big hump. That being said, grizzly bears have been seen around here, as have wolves, though not very common. They have traditionally called these mountains home. And they still roam these hills to this day. So when I first moved here and bought my property, my first goal was to start planting food for my garden. And eventually that would be trees as well, fruit trees and nut trees. So my next door neighbor has lived out here for decades and has gardened out here. He grows a little bit of everything. He grows hops, he grows vegetables. He's grown cannabis out here, guerrilla style, back before it was a thing. So he has a pretty good idea of growing food and trying to eke out a decent crop in a less than suitable climate with a very short growing season. And one of the first things he told me was, do not use any fish fertilizer or animal-based fertilizer. And I thought he was kind of crazy when he told me that. I didn't really believe him. I mean, he's in his 80s, so I respect the wisdom. But he told me, he's like, you cannot use any fish meal, no animal products, no blood meal, no bone meal, because it will bring every animal down from these mountains into the garden, and you will have to deal with that. And for a while I practiced, actually no, there was when I first bought the off-grid property out here, I was still living in the city, so I wasn't gardening out here all the time. It was in the spring and summer for the most part. So there was one time when I did throw down some fish meal, but I buried it really good. My thought is that's going to keep the scent down. Anyway, fast forward a few years to the pandemic. And I had moved out here full time during that time. So I moved out here and during the pandemic, and if you remember during that time, there wasn't a whole lot of fertilizer to be had. There was this big gardening boom. Everybody was stuck at home and they wanted to garden. So all the gardening supplies were depleted. There were supply chain shortages of gardening supplies and fertilizer, soil, you name it. So I was able to come up with I needed some nutrients for my fruit trees because I planted a little over 20 apple trees. I've also got figs, hazelnuts, and some pear trees. So the only fertilizer I was able to find during that year, I think it was the first or second year of the pandemic, was a tree fertilizer with fish meal in it, among other things. A lot of animal products. I didn't think twice about it. So I used this stuff, nothing happened really. I didn't notice any difference right away. I didn't see a bunch of animals coming from the hills. But one day I was sitting in my place and I look out the window and I noticed a furry animal walk by, and I thought it was a dog at first glance because I saw its dark fur, and I was like, oh, whose dog is that? That's a big dog. And I went and looked out the window, and it wasn't a dog, it was a giant black bear. And the black bear was walking into my greenhouse where I had a little bit left of this fish meal fertilizer. He hung out there in a while. He left a paw print in the mud that spring, which you could see. And so at that point I decided it's probably a good idea to heed the warning and to not use fish meal or animal-based nutrients or amendments in my garden or my orchard. Anyways, so a few days later, it might have been a few weeks later. At that time I had started a seasonal gig with the National Park Service, working maintenance, where I also encountered quite a few bears. And one day after work, I came back and I noticed a bear was walking through my yard, and kind of a loop, and noticed there wasn't that fertilizer there anymore. And it made its way over to my next door neighbors, the old guy's beehives. And this bear meant business. I saw him walk over to the bee. I watched the whole thing happen. I watched the bear walk over one of the hives, just get up on his hinds, stands up tall, and he just puts his paws down and crushes the entire beehive. And this swarm of thousands of bees just erupted. And they were stinging this bear. The bear was kind of twitching. It did not care because it was getting that honey. That was kind of a funny year. It was a strange year because the winter lasted a lot longer than it usually does. And spring was slow to really blossom. So what we had here was a lot of berries that weren't ripe yet in the early spring. First ones you usually see out here are your salmon berries. They're usually the earliest. So when a bear comes out from sleeping over the winter, hibernation essentially, the first thing they want to do is eat. And when they're sleeping in higher elevations, they come down to the valleys here, like this one you see behind me, to look for food. They'll eat anything. They'll eat grubs, they'll eat worms, they'll eat whatever they can get their hands on. But once the berries start to pick up, that's what they love to munch on. So this bear jumped on my neighbor's beehive during that year when there was a really late winter and there were no berries. So this bear was hungry, and you could tell. So it wasn't there very long. It was making a lot of noise. The crash of the collapse of the beehive was loud enough to wake my neighbor from a nap. And he saw the bear out there. He took out a 12-gauge shotgun, and he squeezed off a round of double-aught buckshot from his 12-gauge, followed by a slug. And the bear was gone. I don't think the bear actually got hit. I didn't see any trail of blood. It heard the sound, and it took off. And I have doubts on my neighbor's aim at that point too, because he was really shaken up after that. It freaked him out. That was probably the most dramatic bear encounter I've had out here. Most of them have been pretty tame. Another encounter I had was actually that same summer. I was working for the National Park Service, and there was a bear that kept going to a campsite. This bear had been tagged the previous year at the same campsite for going into human food that wasn't stored properly. Again, this is a human problem. We have to learn how to coexist with these animals. They can't be used to eating human food, and if you're at a campsite in the middle of the wilderness and you got a bunch of human food out, it's easy pickings for the bear. And so they get accustomed to this food, and therein lies the problem. So this bear was raiding campsites, and actually I saw it one day. I heard it. I was listening to my radio, Well, I was driving around in the federal government Ford Ranger, and I'd always hear about, it was like every day you'd hear about this bear in the campsite, either taking a nap or taking somebody's food. So this was on the national park radar for a while. They brought in a bear specialist, a bear biologist from elsewhere in the Department of Interior, who was an expert at bears. I'd worked for the National Park Service for a month, and they had me training my coworker, and I think it was his first or second day. And we were making the rounds around the campsite, picking up recycling, doing the rounds, stuff like that. And we hear about this bear, and the bear biologist is there. And so we go on this journey around this campsite, walking around following this bear. The instructions of the bear biologist was to grab a stick and a rock and make a lot of noise. I had my whistle with me that day. And I was like, hey, maybe this loud whistle will be a deterrent. Because I've heard that before. That's a good survival thing to have when you're hiking or in the backcountry, is a whistle, because it doesn't require a lot of energy to make a lot of noise. And a lot of things, they'll hear that and it'll spook them. Possibly a bear. She didn't want me, the bear biologist did not want me using this whistle. So we banged these sticks on tree stumps for a while, made a bunch of noise, and we chased this bear around out to the outskirts of the campgrounds. And at one point, the bear biologist was like, hey, throw a few rocks at this thing, let's scare this thing off and, make it afraid of humans. So we did that, and my coworker, who I was training, actually hit the bear with a rock right in the body. Not, you hear a thud, it didn't hurt it. It was enough to make it spook it and have it run a little further up the hill, but it was still in close range, just kind of bummed out. It looked sad more than anything. And the bear biologist was like, no, don't hurt him. So another few days passed, and then word got out that someone had set a backpack down on a trailhead. It had a backpack, it had some food in it, lunch, and next to this backpack was one of these child-carrying backpacks with an infant. And apparently this same bear, who I at this time was calling Yogi, victim of circumstance, this bear grabbed this backpack right next to the infant. And that was kind of the final straw for the National Park Service dealing with this tagged bear. I believe the next day I was off of work, and I believe the law enforcement, park rangers, shot the bear and ended its life and terminated the bear. You gotta take away the food source. I've also seen bears, go through trash that's out in seedy mountain hovels that have trash piled up. There's a few of them out here. The bears have been known to get into those trash piles just because it's too easy. And they get used to it. So that same season, it was the last day of my season in the National Park Service. And I noticed it was my last day. I was making the rounds. I was driving up to the campsite from, headquarters. So I saw this black bear when I was making my way in the Park Service truck up to the campsite to make my normal daily rounds on my last day of the season, my last day of work. And I saw this bear. He's probably a couple years old, just making his way up the river, just like this, but quite a few miles outside of here. This bear was making its way up and down the river. It looked like it was fishing. Now, most of these bears here don't fish year-round. They just don't. The fish are very seasonal too. They usually come in the fall, and in some places they're you're not going to get a big salmon. So I saw this bear in the morning. I got some film of it. It was October. It was late October. This bear had gone from, it had been sunny for pretty much the whole summer. It was like 60, 70 degrees one day, and then the next day it snowed, up in the, I think at like 2,000, 3,000 feet. So it was like winter happened like that. So this bear was in hibernation mode. This bear wanted to get as much food as it could in the amount of time it had before it was winter. So it was actually fishing for salmon. And here it is. I came back later on that afternoon after my shift, when my shift was getting over, and that same bear was still fishing along the bank a little further downstream this time. And I actually saw it, you'll see it, catch a salmon and drag it out of the water and bring it into the woods. And it was just amazing. And I was on the other side of the river, so it would have been like, across the river. So I was a decent distance from it. It wasn't a perceivable threat. That being said, bears are really fast. They can outrun a human easily. I've seen that many times. I've seen a bear sprint, and you're not going to outrun a bear. It's just not going to happen. They're too fast. But I had a decent buffer, and it seemed occupied with the fishing, and I wasn't a threat. Another memorable bear encounter I had last summer was further up in elevation in the high country, up where the glaciers are. I was on a hike in the back country up to the glacier, and I got word from a few hikers on the trail. There was a few hikers on the trail that day. Blueberries everywhere on the side of this mountain. I go up there usually every fall, late summer, and there's always bears feasting on blueberries, and they are just abundant. So I was up on a higher ridge, and I actually saw this bear from a higher vantage point. I was above where the bear was, and I could see it kind of hanging out quite a ways from the trail, above the trail, quite a ways above the trail. So it was staying away from people. It was just eating blueberries for hours. So I kind of tracked the bear from above. I could see him. Really didn't think much of it. There were a few other hikers that thought it was pretty neat. But on my way down on the trail, I didn't think I was going to come that close to it. But here you go. So I'm walking down the trail. There's another hiker in front of me that stopped. She informed me that the bear was really close, and I was like, yeah, I saw it, further when I was up the trail a ways. I saw him up on the hill. He was making his way down. I wasn't sure how close he was. And she told me that he was right there. So I stopped and I paused and I looked, and here he walks right out in front of me on the trail. I mean, not far at all. Not quite close enough to pet, but a little too close for comfort. Now he's a big bear. A giant. He's a beast. A wild beast. And I had my bear spray with me, which I carried on my hip, a little holster. So I got that out, just to have it in hand. Most of these bears, they don't want trouble. Maybe if you run up on a sow and some cubs, or an aggressive grizzly, it's possible. But I could tell this bear wasn't acting super aggressive. That being said, I wanted a little bit of space between me and him. So I had my bear spray out. The young lady on the trail in front of me was kind of freaked out, you could tell. She just wanted to get out of there, and eventually once the bear made its way down the hill, she did. But at one point, the bear turns at me and looks at me and kind of gives me a look. Like he wants to walk towards me, a real curious look. And I stood my ground, and I talked to the animal. I always talk to the animal. You want to make your presence be known. You want to be a hunter and not prey. That being said, I don't want to hurt this animal. But it took a look at me, and I stayed forward facing the animal, and I started to walk backwards just a little bit to have some room, but standing firm, and not turning my back to the animal. Bear spray in hand. The bear looked a little bit interested in me, like it was curious. So just as a precaution, I picked up a rock, just as a little extra insurance, and I continued filming. I got this footage of this majestic beast snacking on blueberries and making its way down the side of a alpine mountain. I did not have to use the bear spray at all. The hiker that was in front of me, who was really freaked out, just absolutely booked. And I stood there and I just, for a few minutes, just respected just the presence of that beast, that animal, and made my way down the mountain on my way. One of the closest bear encounters I've had, and definitely the size of the animal really kind of added to the intensity of the moment. So really the moral of the story is always carry some bear spray and be prepared. Stand your ground. And respect the wildlife in your surroundings. They know how to live here better than most humans do. That is an understatement. They are the ultimate survivalists. Because for the grizzlies especially, they are the ultimate survivalists because occasionally they can make it here still, and yet they were pretty much hunted to extinction. What are your experiences with wildlife encounters? Have you encountered a aggressive bear? Have you had to use countermeasures to allow for your safe passage through the wilderness or an environment? Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this video. Consider hitting that like button for the YouTube algorithm and subscribing. I appreciate you. Happy New Year, and thanks for joining me on In the Mountains with Ken.